I've always loved the ocean and interacting with its inhabitants, from the biggest whales to the smallest fish. But one can't help but wonder, what do fish experience? Do they feel pain? Well, in recent years, scientific evidence has been mounting that they do, but fish pain skeptics have a counter-argument. In this film, we'll show how a rare brain damage patient undermines that counter, enabling us to conclude that fish do feel pain. Our story begins at the dawn of the 21st century, when some of the first neuroscience evidence of fish pain emerged.
People didn't really know much about the fish brain at all. It hadn't been particularly well studied. In fact, what was really remarkable was that until the beginning of the 21st century, nobody had even looked for nociceptors in fish. Nociceptors are the sensory neurons that allow us to experience pain in the environment.
Even in the 1990s, we still didn't know whether fish had these nociceptors, and it was generally accepted that fish don't experience pain because they don't have the nervous system. And so this seemed quite crazy to me because it really is an important alarm system. So I decided to have a look for these nociceptors in fishes, and I explored the rainbow trout. And lo and behold, when we looked at the anatomy of the nervous system and we recorded from the nociceptors directly, they acted just like the nociceptors we have in our bodies.
People first discovered nociceptors in fish in the early 2000s, but the problem is that just having the essentially equipment available to feel pain in the environment is not enough to understand whether the animals experience pain.
The experience of pain, or its emotional component, is often called pain affect, so affect with an A. And following Sneddon's key breakthrough in discovering nociceptors in fish, a subsequent experiment was developed to probe for this affective side of pain.
We looked to see whether the zebrafish would pay a cost to accessing pain relief. And what we did was we basically trained the fish, and we gave them a choice of two chambers. One chamber was barren, brightly lit, which zebrafish don't like, and the other chamber was enriched with plants and gravel and had a shoal of fish behind a transparent panel. And the zebrafish chose the enriched side, they preferred it. And once they had done that many times, we then assigned them to different treatment groups. And one of those groups had a painful stimulus applied. But in half of those fish, we dissolved a pain-relieving drug in the barren, brightly lit, unfavourable chamber to determine whether the zebrafish would pay a cost to accessing pain relief. What happened was that the fish in pain did indeed switch their preference from the enriched chamber and actually spent a lot of time in this barren, unpreferred chamber. And we hypothesized this is because they felt bad from the pain and they sought to reduce that negative feeling by entering the barren environment where they felt better. When we looked at animals which were in pain, but there was no pain relief in the barren chamber, they didn't spend hardly any time in the barren chamber. They went back to their preferred chamber. And if we gave the animals morphine at the same time, then they didn't show that preference for the barren chamber, even when it had analgesics in.
This just can't be the fish showing a stimulus response reaction to being given a painful stimulus, because they've made this higher level representation of the link between that analgesic environment and the environment where they were given that painful stimulus.
This shows us quite clearly that the fish has a negative, subjective, internal experience associated with pain, that it is willing to pay the cost of entering an unfavourable, unpreferred environment if it feels better.
Now, we know very clearly from a whole series of experiments done on anxiety in zebrafish, for example, that zebrafish will show very strong behavioural responses to anxiety-provoking stimuli, of which, of course, pain is one. And we're now at a point in the literature where zebrafish are routinely used for screening new drugs for anxiety without any question whatsoever. And so if they have the capacity to experience anxiety, which is very closely linked to the psychological effects of pain, there's absolutely no reason to think that there would not be a psychological component to the pain response.
We are in pain, we are dominated by pain, and we do other things very poorly. So my lab basically exposed fish to strange objects. And normally fish show a neophobia, they show a fear of strange objects. But when they're in pain, they don't show any fear of the object, they go very close to it. And of course that shows that they don't show an appropriate fear response. And so they're dominated by the pain. We've also used predator cues, and of course the motivation to avoid being eaten by animals is very strong. And yet when the animals are in pain, they don't show anti-predator behavior. And so these studies together prove that pain is a very important state for the fish and that they perform other things less well when they are in pain.
Another window into the experience of fish comes from a phenomenon called fear contagion.
Fear contagion is when an individual sees another individual expressing fear behavior, and then they also show that fear behavior even though they're not exposed to the fear stimulus.
We know from some fantastic experiments that were carried out by Rui Oliveira's group, where they looked at emotional contagion and fear contagion in fish. And in these experiments, they showed a fish observing another fish being chased around a tank with a net. They then took that fish away and then put it into that context, never having experienced that context before itself. And those fish that saw another animal in that context tended to avoid it and tended to show fear behaviours.
So that shows that the fish can recognise emotions in another individual and then react similarly. And that's quite a higher cognitive function.
One might think that fish have very poor memories, and so their pain is less of a psychological burden. But recent studies have shown the opposite.
One of the striking things about fish that I've learned since I've worked with them is that their memories are actually remarkable in the sense that not only do they demonstrate what we call working memory, so the ability to use the memory during a kind of ongoing task, but they also demonstrate a fantastic capacity for long-term memory. And in fact, a study published a couple of years ago demonstrated that fish that were cleaner fish that were shown or were exposed to an aversive stimulus had a memory of that stimulus up to a year later. This idea of a 3-second memory of fish was kind of blown out of the water.
So skeptics have suggested that the response to pain in fish is just a simple reflex response and would be limited to reflex centres in the hindbrain and spinal cord. To really address this criticism, went to a lab which performs functional MRI that images the brain in live animals. And what we found was that the forebrain and midbrain areas lit up. And so this is not just a simple reflex. And many of the areas that we found that were active in fishes are similar to the areas that mammals use for pain processing.
We can also look at the genes associated with pain, and in particular, humans without a gene called NTRK1 cannot feel pain.
So do fishes have this gene? Are they able to experience pain? Well, back in the early 2000s, as technology has advanced and we can now screen the genome of an organism and find out all of the genes that they have, this gene has been found in fishes.
Indeed, there's enough similarity between people and fishes that scientists use fish as a model for psychiatric drug development.
In my group, we do a lot of work on looking at individual differences in fish that allow us to understand more about human behaviour. So in terms of, for example, psychiatric problems, mental health problems, we look at, for example, fish that show more kind of negatively biased behaviours, a bit like you might expect from humans with depression. And you actually see quite remarkable differences in fish, where some will be much more outgoing than others, some will be much more impulsive than others, some will be much more cautious than others in behavioural tests. And all of these factors together show us that there are some quite stark differences in personality factors between fish. And what's really interesting is even fish that come from very, very closely linked genetic families will show very strong individual differences.
And the variety of personalities is the sort of thing we might expect if fish are something like persons, if they have some sort of inner sense of self. Now, perhaps there isn't a perfect test for self-awareness, but the tests we do have been applied to fish.
There are studies in fish showing that they can recognise themselves distinct from other fish. For example, in cichlid fish, they can recognise their own smell as opposed to the smell of other fish. There is a study in manta rays where they placed a mirror inside the manta ray's tank, and the manta rays actually performed what's called mirror-directed behaviours. When the mirror was present, the manta rays would wave at the mirror, they would blow bubbles during their swim past the mirror. When the mirrors were made matte and the animals couldn't see themselves, they wouldn't perform these behaviours. So these were definitely behaviours that were directed towards their image. But a more compelling study is one that's been done in cleaner fish. And this study used the mirror recognition test. This is the gold standard in understanding whether an animal is conscious and recognises itself. And so what you do is you show the cleaner fish a mirror, and if they recognise themselves, what you then do is you place a colour on the animal. And if the animal tries to wipe that colour off, that means it recognises itself in the mirror, it recognises there's something on it, and it should seek to remove it. And that's exactly what these cleaner fish do.
Nevertheless, fish pain skeptics argue that pain is processed in cortical areas of the brain that fish don't have, and so they don't feel pain.
By their reasoning, basically fish shouldn't be able to see because fish don't have a highly developed visual cortex, the same as humans. And yet, of course, fish can see. This argument that you have to have a specific brain area to be able to experience pain really falls down when you think that fishes are able to interact with their environment in very complicated ways. They can see, they can smell, they can taste, they experience touch. So to suggest that this one sensory function is lacking because they don't have the highly developed cortex that we have does not make sense.
One cortical region that's relevant is the prefrontal cortex. If this part of the brain does self-awareness and fish don't have it, then perhaps fish aren't aware of their pain. But we can test if this is necessary if we find a human without a prefrontal cortex. And that's exactly what happened when patient R was discovered.
Patient R suffered from a herpes encephalitis infection,
which destroyed extensively many parts of his brain on both sides, including the prefrontal cortex, but also the anterior cingulate cortex and the insular cortex.
Left him with pretty severe anterograde amnesia.
This is a patient that was very interesting for research because many of the brain regions that had been deemed associated with self-consciousness, emotion, were destroyed in this patient. And we worked with him, studying him extensively with many classical tests and novel tests to probe his abilities. In all respects, he was absolutely normal.
When you talk to patient R, he's, that you couldn't be able to tell unless you went away and then came back 5 minutes later and had to be reintroduced again, that there was anything too unusual going on.
Carissa Philippi, the lead author of the paper, also did extensive follow-up interviews with patient R.
And she asked him directly things like, are you aware of yourself? Which he found to be like kind of a preposterous question. He said something like, well, of course I am. I'm here talking to you.
The claim that you would need the prefrontal cortex to have self-awareness was obviously, given the damage of patient R and the fact that he had a totally preserved self-awareness in many respects, completely debunked by our results.
Patient R's case made headlines around the world. It showed that you don't need a prefrontal cortex for self-awareness. But fish pain skeptics focus on two other brain areas known as the insular and the ACC, or anterior cingulate cortex, claiming these are essential for pain affect, the emotional component of pain. But amazingly, patient R has lost both of these regions as well. So I thought this had huge implications for the debate as to which animals can feel pain, because if patient R can feel pain, then these regions can't be necessary for pain, and the last argument of fish pain skeptics would be defeated. So I got in contact with David and Ken, who had worked with patient R, And they agreed. Now, the issue of pain in animals hadn't really been on their radar, but it was on mine, as I had sort of debated a famous theologian who was making very similar claims to fish pain skeptics. So eventually we wrote up our findings, but when we first started the process, I had no idea they were already examining patient R's pain perception.
Oh, so we did several protocols, including with what is called a cold pressor. It's just water in a bucket, in a somewhat sophisticated bucket that is at 0 degrees, but there is a flow that is induced by some device inside the buckets that prevents the water to freeze. And when you put your arm in this bucket, it's actually really painful, though it's absolutely innocuous. It's not dangerous at all. And you want to remove your arms as fast as possible. And so we asked him that, of course, he could remove his arm whenever he wanted to, but we asked him to keep it as long as possible in the bucket. And we had him also rate, with the other hand, the intensity of his pain experience and the affective reaction that he had to this pain on different scale. And all his reactions, including vocalization, facial expression that we analyze rigorously with standard protocol, psychophysiological responses, heart rate that increase, skin conductance, etc., and of course this subjective experience of pain on both the intensity and the affective dimension were absolutely normal, and if actually they were even a little stronger on the affective side than what we had observed with comparison participant.
Patient R is hyperpathic to pain, which means he's unusually sensitive to it. This is the exact opposite of what we would expect to find if the fish pain skeptics are right. Now, the ACC does light up in pain studies, and one possibility as to why is that it's not doing pain, rather it's trying to suppress pain. And if that's true, animals without the ACC might feel pain to be worse, and patient R's hyperpathic pain experience may be an indication of that. But it does raise the question, well, what brain regions are necessary for pain?
So we don't have a single location. We can't point and say this area is only involved in pain processing, but it's part of a much larger system. So there's other structures that are not damaged that have to be processed into these signals. The data is clear. He experiences negative affect. That's clear. His perceptual experience has to be due to other brain areas or structures processing these signals.
As the cortex doesn't seem to be necessary for affect, we need to look at more basic brain structures known as subcortical regions.
So some of the brain areas that would be involved in processing of these signals to provide patient R with his perceptual experience of pain would have to be subcortical brain structures.
Extensive research has demonstrated that non-cortical structures, what we call subcortical structures, so if you imagine the cortex is a covering of the brain, subcortical structures, also respond to painful stimuli, not only in fish, but in mammals as well. There is no evidence that the experience of pain is just cortical. Just because humans happen to have cortical events during painful stimuli does not mean that the cortex has to be the cause of that event, because other regions are activated as well.
You know, I've attended lots of scientific conferences and talks and neuroscience related work, and you attend these conferences, and one thing you realize is that the brain areas such as the cingulate cortex, not only does it light up in the pain studies, but it lights up in virtually every poster you look at. It lights up. And so we're not talking about a center for pain processing. We're talking about a system that is more broadly involved in modulating our behavior.
Another line of evidence that fish pain skeptics cite is that if we remove the ACC in humans, then pain could be eliminated. So that does seem to show that the ACC is necessary for pain. But what they don't mention is that after a while, the pain comes back.
So we thought at one time, well, to get rid of pain, just eliminate the signals going into the spinal cord. Pain goes away. Well, that doesn't work. Well, do that, do a cordotomy. Cut the tracks from going up the spinal cord up to the brainstem. Cut those tracks. Get rid of the pain. Well, pain comes back. Go up to the brain. Lesion out the brain area. Get rid of the pain. Pain comes back.
The fact that the pain comes back may imply that the brain recruits these regions contingently, so that if they are gone, the brain will just use something else for pain. Similarly, if fish don't have these regions, their brains will use something else for pain. And we have good evidence that subcortical regions are sufficient to generate basic affective states. So for example, children born with hydroencephaly, that's a condition where they don't have a cortex, they still show emotions. Patient B, another patient who had key cortical regions knocked out, had an emotional life afterwards. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence comes from the father of affective neuroscience, Jaak Panksepp.
So Jaak Panskep's work is very important in this connection because it seems to show that, well, a number of things. The experience of emotion might be primarily subcortical in its nature, rather than requiring prefrontal and more cortical areas, sort of the basic experience, because you can stimulate it directly in humans and also in animals like rats. You get exactly the same sort of reaction, a sort of direct brain stimulation of certain areas. And if you give, for example, the rats control over the stimulation, they won't stimulate, they won't sort of, hit the lever to stimulate negative things that we would think of as negatively valenced emotions. They will avoid that. And for positively valenced ones, they'll keep hitting it at the expense of eating food and other sort of essential things. They can even, drop dead from doing this. What this seems to show is that emotions are generated at the subcortical level, which pushes against the idea that this is all prefrontal or cortical in general.
One thing is certain, if that's the case, these type of structures are represented almost everywhere in the animal kingdom.
But even if these cortical regions are necessary for pain in humans, it doesn't follow that they are necessary in other animals.
Just because an organism lacks a certain structure doesn't mean that it doesn't have some other structure that performs an analogous function. Right? So humans swim like this. Right?
You wouldn't say fish can't swim because they don't have human-like arms and legs.
If you imagine the path of evolution, the likelihood that exactly the same brain regions will have evolved for exactly the same process is very slim, because actually brain regions don't evolve in order for that process to happen. Something happens and then that brain region becomes used for that process. So the fact that fish have different brain structures to mammals does not at all mean that they are not capable of experiencing the same things as those animals. All it means is that if they do experience them, which of course I'm arguing they do, they have recruited different brain regions to do that.
Pain has evolved to act as this very important alarm system to allow us to avoid tissue damage, alert us to danger, and then promote behaviours that ensure there's no further damage and that healing happens. This is adaptive. Evolution has shaped this very important sensory system.
So given how essential pain systems are, we can expect them to be evolutionarily ancient and therefore widespread throughout the animal kingdom.
So anyone who makes the claim that an animal doesn't experience pain because they lack a brain structure that might be present in humans, I believe is wrong.
In the 21st century, we've discovered that fish have pain receptors, that they give up rewards to seek analgesics in painful situations, they show fear contagion, they have the right genetics for pain, and myths about their poor memory or their lack of individuality have been debunked. And finally, we've shown that the cortical regions that fish pain skeptics say are necessary for pain and that fish don't have, well, they're not necessary for pain. To me, this settles the debate. Fish really do feel pain. They do suffer.